can you do a thing about how if you care more about an issue about politics, then you should be allowed to put more votes into it, right? Because something that affects you directly, it's not fair that your vote is worth the same as someone to whom it doesn't affect at all.
You opt out of politics, you get relatively one. So it's not a choice too. So that's why we give people choice. They feel politics is failing them, they can not do this, and then they'll have relatively more income than people who choose to do this.
Yes.
Hey guys.
Yeah. Wait the 2 minutes we're about here, then can you make us in the yeah.
Party or madness.
Yeah, that's the thing, this video of me and I'm not very good at chocolate or something. It's just not chocolate, sorry, but there's a video of me where we
guys. 279. Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. A LEIDEN C here.
I know one person.
Would you mind just giving a shout in the corridor? Thank you. I can somehow manage to get to SL without going over the sky bridge. I'm very confused.
They are running over there, so they're coming now.
They're running.
Nice one.
You can
over
see
there.
them.
Yes, they're coming.
Alright, cool.
They're here.
Yeah, sorry, we follow sets up.
Always happens.
Yeah, you were sitting right next to them. You should just
We made it.
Hi, sorry.
Sorry for that.
Okay. So I have an announcement from the filming team first.
I will be recording this round. If anyone doesn't feel comfortable being filmed, please tell me now.
I wouldn't want to be filmed. I'm really sorry.
That's fine.
Just one quick question. Is it going online after this? It's just being streamed.
Yes, it's being streamed and there's also, it will be posted on YouTube.
Can I choose withdraw consent after the stream? That makes sense. At any point. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so at the end, make sure to check again, nobody wants it not posted online, and make sure it's not filmed
Yeah,
first. Are you speaking second?
I'm speaking second,
So the deputy leader opposition speech must move. Okay,
DLO speech.
great, thank you very much for that. Hi, my name is James, prefer pronouns of he, but I prefer to be referred to as Honourable Speaker. Do you want to introduce yourself to us?
Hi, my name's Emma. I can go by she.
Hi, I'm Rohan. I take pronouns he, him, and his.
Excellent. I'll ask each team to say your speaking order and any pronoun preferences, although you're welcome to not answer or to say you have no preference. Opening government, speaking first.
Hello, I'm Christopher and I prefer he, please.
Stepan second, he please.
Thank you. Opening opposition.
Sadaf MD Halim, speaking first, he please.
Razee speaking second, he please.
Closing government.
Elliot speaking first, I have no preference. And Douglas speaking second,
And closing opposition.
Floris speaking first, he.
And Lisa speaking second, she please.
Excellent. Thanks very much.
I can, yeah.
That'll be alright.
I will only be clapping go. So one clap at 6, 2 claps
I'm
at
going to
7.
time it if that makes it easier.
Yeah, we'll use the time to do things.
Yeah, just
Excellent. You'll get a being at 1, being at 6. Points of information going between there and double being at 7, which is the end of the speech, and I think normally triple at 7:15. Yeah, triple at 7:15, which will be the end of, and certainly not writing process. Yeah, I absolutely. Anyone have any questions? I'd like to call House to order on the motion. This House believes that the Netherlands should allow citizens to purchase additional votes from the government at a cost proportional to their wealth. For example, one additional vote for 1% of wealth. I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister's vote on that proposition.
Panel, under status quo and in the Netherlands and elsewhere, politics is not equal for everyone. The extent to which you have an interest in politics does not correlate to which the ability you can impact your society. The extent to which you care does not impact it. We treat everyone the same in the sense that we give them each one vote, but we fail to recognise things like some people are able to have the time to go out and campaign, some people have the time in their life to influence politics that other individuals specifically don't have. We think at the point in which we put an income incentive to allow people to engage that is relative to your income, meaning it's effectively as painful for you as you have the richest or poorest individual of society, means we allow anyone anyone from any part of the income spectrum who's more interested in politics to become more engaged in it. And we disincentivize low information voters who don't particularly care either to not vote, or we also pertain to get incentivized, because the point at which there is a financial incentive, there is a financial penalization to go and vote, we think low information voters are disproportionately more likely to educate themselves and then become more aware, and you get things like less radicalism, specifically in the context of the Netherlands instance, right? So there'll be 2 points in this case. Firstly on that of informed voting, and secondly on that about empowering those who are shut out, right? First of all, we want to provide you with like a broad mechanism, right? Insofar as we think that the instances provided in the context slide was broadly clear, but other things we'd like to add that is that the state is broadly good at approximating people's incomes from things like income tax, so we'd be roughly able to work out that. It would be the amount, we would do it in such an extent that it would be the amount before tax, right, that we would do it in so far, and then take it off you, so it would be disproportionately penalise those who are wealthier in society, make it harder for them to vote, and make it easier for those who are poorer. We still think that is proportionate amount of your like gross income, and so far, but not proportionate to your net income. Secondly, we wouldn't allow individuals to trade votes at the point of where, or give them, or sell them on a black market. You'd literally only be able to buy them from the state. That of course stops out richer individuals proceeding to buy them off poorer ones for lower sums than they would be able to do. Right, we think the context of this debate, as I've already explained, is that certain individuals are able to put money in who are wealthier to form political parties, to go out and campaign, to spend time they have. We don't provide an opportunity to poorer voters who might also be interested, because it isn't a relative amount of your income you put in, as in you have to have a certain amount to access the political process. You have to have a certain amount to have to be safe enough in your income that you can go out and campaign in certain times, in certain instances, to form political parties, to have a career, to get the degree you need to be respected enough to run for office. That isn't a proportional thing, that is something that is specifically limited to other individuals. When we make it proportional, we allow individuals to access politics to a greater extent. And why is the specific mechanism for that? Is because it is now relative, right? And this is important, right? Because certain individuals will not proceed to buy votes because they do not care particularly about politics. So that means when poorer individuals proceed to buy those votes, their vote is now relatively more influential than it would have been, because they're buying votes, and lots of other people who don't care about votes do not do so, specifically middle class individuals who are broadly satisfied with it or don't think it's worth the value. First point of substantive on informed voting, right? We say many people are disengaged from voting for a number of reasons. They have specifically low information voters who often vote against their interests. They're disengaged from voting because they see politics as being broadly corrupt. They see the system and the establishment as broadly working against them, and they don't specifically engage in those instances, often because they simply don't care about those systems. Right? We think in the Netherlands example, that means you have things like the rise of Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom, that as recently as 2013 was in a coalition with the mainstream, not a coalition with the mainstream VVO, but provide them with a supply and demand support. Right? Even though this is a party, for example, that does things like promote hardline economic liberalism, but also advocates for the decline of the Dutch welfare state, things that work against the interests of people in exit polling who were shown to vote for them. They were shown in exit polling to broadly support the policies that were oppositional to them, but because they were not informed enough about these voting parties, all they saw was the populist rhetoric and the fear rhetoric that came from that party. We say we do broadly believe that if a voter is totally uninformed, it is broadly better that they are removed from that system and don't vote. So if we deter low information voters who already don't care that much about politics for reasons I explained, and will likely no longer care because of the economic disincentive, certainly to have relative influence. So even if they still have one vote, because they'll be relatively less enfranchised, that means they'll be relatively less harmful in that instance. But at the point at which they do really care, they can get informed, they can see that, and they can no longer vote against their interests, which is obviously a good thing, specifically for them, but also for wider society, right? And as such, you have individuals investigating the policies of political parties, becoming more informed, becoming more knowledgeable on the political process they go to vote for. Now, thank you. I'll take some at the end of this point. If also, we do think it is broadly reasonable, if you care more about politics, that you should have more sway in it. But also, we think this is also important. We think if you don't care about politics, it's also perfectly reasonable to get something from that. That is to say, if you think the system has fundamentally failed you, and you really dislike politics, why not do what everyone else is doing and buy a vote? And because everyone else is buying a vote and their incomes are relatively lesser, you can keep your vote and have, relatively speaking, in an economic system, more economic capital. Now, thank you. So you can choose that you believe, for whatever reason, that the political system has failed you, as many people do. For example, in most countries, I don't specifically know the Netherlands example, but in most societies, there are significant amounts of people who do not turn out to vote, and the Netherlands doesn't have mandatory voting. So there's a significant amount of individuals who choose to do that. It's reasonable that they feel disenfranchised enough to not go and vote. Before I move on, I'll take opening.
What deters low information voters from no longer voting in your world?
The financial disincentive, right? These are people who don't particularly care about voting in the first instance, right? And now, even if they do get one, say, free vote, it means they won't get the second and third. And when other people do get the second and third vote, that means that they are relatively less impactful. For example, one vote versus three in a wider spectrum means that they're less influential. Secondly, how he empowers those who are shut out, right? not everyone can access politics, and specifically those who care about it, who have an interest in it, who are passionate about making society better, who feel specifically affected by politics for a number of reasons. And the first, they want to make a difference, but also more impactful reasons. They feel that the group that they represent in society is shut out, and they want to make a difference. But some groups are sufficiently shut out, right? Even in broadly liberal countries like the Netherlands, women are relatively shut out of politics in relation to men. That because even when you have context, so thank you, of things like gender quotas, you still have less women joining political parties in the first place. You have less women putting themselves forward in selection conventions than you do have men. This is broadly noted for things like men tend to apply for positions they tend to be less qualified for, right? We think these barriers do structurally exist, that women feel that they can't put themselves forward, but also poorer people within these societies, even in the Netherlands, do not have the type of social capital you need to get selected, do not have the ability to make speeches at selection conferences that could persuade people, put in the work to do so, specifically in parties that are more broadly established, right? And oftentimes individuals don't have the economic capital to do things like campaigning, right? So basically, it's easier to do campaigning when you're middle class, at the time which you can take time off work and do that, but you don't have to be providing care for your family, right? And as such, you need large sums in the instances to do things like create political parties. What we say now is because those mechanisms are shut out for some specific groups, this is a specific mechanism we give those groups, right? Because I explained, right, not everyone will do this. There are people who will care more about their financial capital, right? What that means is that when these individuals choose to do this, right, and it's a relative thing that affects everyone equally, it will mean that that their sway of influence in an election will increase greatly because against the people who do not choose to do so, and allowing themselves to get the kind of extra benefits we already allow more influential people to get within society. We explained because we're going to do this on gross and not net income that this policy will disproportionately benefit the poorest individuals in society. We think giving those people a mechanism by which to get more involved in politics in the Netherlands is a good outcome. Happy to propose.
I'd like to thank the speakers from up, so I'd like to welcome the Leader of Opposition to open up the opposition case.
Access is a means to an end, but access should not be the end, especially when having access can lead to pernicious side effects which destroy a very fine, a very stable political system that exists in the Netherlands. This debate happens in the backdrop of a functional democracy which works to provide individuals' rights, which works to shorten gender differences, which works to give minorities like the LGBTQ communities their own rights. With that background in mind, we think it's particularly harmful to give access to individuals that don't deserve it. We think the fundamental principle substantive coming in from the opening opposition directly contrasts to what they're saying, right? They say, they're trying to assert that at the end of the day, it's not problematic if you don't care about politics, you should still have access to that political system. Principle one, we don't think it's fundamentally correct. Because why? Because understand that in any political system, there's a very essential check and balance that ensures that what you do in the political system comes back to you in the form of repercussions. What does the average politician in principle do? He does things for society, and society responds by electing him or otherwise. This applies universally throughout the parliament. This is something distinct, and this is something that never applies in a world where individuals can simply buy votes in the parliament. Because that added responsibility that you get, you don't have any accountability for it. We think that's essentially dangerous on many levels, right? So for instance, on further principle grounds, what does the average politician do? He makes long-term policies. Policies he formulates affects individuals on a very global scale that also, at the end of the day, come back to him in a long-term manner. He has a political career, which means he's invested in a way that the average citizen is not. Understand what the average citizen with such a power can do. He can institute short-term changes that do not come back to him because his vested interest does not lie in the political sphere. He can vote for things that does not matter to a lot of people but matters to him, but the consequences of a wrong voting never goes back to him. Principally, that is utterly problematic because at the end of the day, these individuals get unconventional voting powers, and we think this skewed power is particularly dangerous because it does not have repercussions for those individuals. With the principle out of the way, there's lots of things to consider here, right? Rebuttals shall be integrated. Understand the concept of marginal utility and why such a policy will never ensure that middle class representation or lower class representation ever happens. Understand what happens, right? 1% of wealth to the average middle class individual is very different from 1% of wealth to the society's elite. Understand why? Because the elites live off a huge obscene excess. They have a lifestyle that they can ensure by sacrificing a large portion of their money. That never applies to the largest part of society, because to that part of society, 1% of their money means a lot. So even if it's proportional, even if it's the same chunk of money, what that same chunk of money can get you is very different. So if that same chunk of money for the average middle class student can mean going to a worse school, that means nothing for the elite, because that does not cause changes in his lifestyle, changes in the quality of his life. As a result of which, we think this uniquely empowers the rich and specifically the elite to buy into the political process, to have unreasonable sway over the political process. We think that's particularly dangerous. Also, they talk about like voter turnout and how like low information voters will stop coming. We don't think that's the case. Understand how low information voting increases. When you have sway within the political sphere, without being invested in the political sphere, you inform yourself about only the things that you want. Which means your overall information or the symmetry of information that you're supposed to have over the range of topics that you're supposed to be voting about does not work. You only inform yourself about those sorts of things. For instance, if someone at ExxonMobil buys a vote, his interests lie distinctly in furthering the interests of an oil company. Those sorts of things. His incentive to think about other issues is marginal, if not non-existent. Because at the end of the day, these voters buy into the political process because of vested interest. And their information or the amount of information that they're incentivized to gain is limited to the interest that they have specifically. We think overall, this means voters will have like lesser and lesser incentive to learn about issues, and low information voters are likely to increase because the people getting the additional votes are likely low information voters because their incentive to look for information elsewhere is different. The reason they're buying that additional vote is because they have an agenda. So as long as that vote is tied to that agenda, it's very difficult to convince ourselves that that individual will inform himself of otherwise. Also, other individuals who they say will stop voting, that doesn't work, right? Because your incentive to vote, your sway isn't changed when someone else gets additional sway. You still get that one vote. So on a marginal comparative, we don't think those individuals will suddenly stop voting, all those ill-informed individuals that they don't care about. But on the flip side, we think a lot of people who are ill-informed will start getting more votes, and we think that's particularly dangerous. Unique harms that opening opposition will give you, right? So the main problem is that in the Netherlands is a beautiful system where it's very difficult for corporate interests or Wall Streetization of politics to happen. Because there are so many divided political parties, it's very difficult to know which party you will back will end up giving you the things you want. Because in the United States, for instance, when you have a two-party system or a multi-party system where you know for sure that a certain party is likely to win, you back a party, if that party wins an election, you get what you want. That doesn't work in the Netherlands because power is shared beautifully. Understand what happens in a world where corporate interests can come in. Because understand, under the analysis that I've given you, it's much more likely that corporation heads, hedge fund managers, those sorts of people will be the ones who have large amounts of votes in the political system. What it does is, at the end of the day, it incentivizes richer political parties to have more sway in the process. How is this a reality, right? At the end of the day, realistically, in any scenario, richer political parties have more sway. This is aggravated in a world where you can literally buy votes. Under that system, richer political parties are much more likely to win elections because you can literally get yourself more votes. What happens as a direct corollary of that? As a direct corollary of that, it's much more easier to visualize which parties are likely to win. Under that system, it's much more easier to understand at the end of the day backing which party will give you returns that you want. In that sort of society, politicization is mixed with capitalism, is mixed with commercialization. At the end of the day, the political process of the Netherlands is one that caters to most people, is one that benefits a lot of people. The point at which you introduce commercialization, the point at which you introduce these individuals, these corporate interests, it reduces in the Dutch politics to a politics that is resemblant of the West, of the US, those sorts of politics. We think the Dutch politics works in and of itself. We think it's a good system. We don't want interference. We think giving people additional sway is unfair, widens gaps, and makes things unfair for everyone in the world. In the Dutch population, we're very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank that for those remarks. So we'll do depth for our ministers to very much for the formal panel. So we agree that the Dutch political system is, broadly speaking, better than some political systems in the world. That doesn't mean that it cannot be better. Specifically, myself and Christopher see two issues in the status quo. Firstly, that even in countries like the Netherlands, there is a structural imbalance in the relative political power of rich individuals versus poor individuals, where the richer individuals have more political connections, more money, and more ability to affect the political system in a way in which the poor don't. And secondly, that we have seen a proliferation of uninformed voting within systems like the Netherlands, leading to parties like Freedom for the Netherlands or whatever, getting into political power. These are the issues that we seek to solve. 4 things in this speech. Firstly, responses to what we just heard. Secondly, why we think it is in principle legitimate to want to be able to convert your income into votes. Thirdly, discussing the imbalance between rich and poor. And fourthly, uninformed voting, examining the responses that we got, Christopher. So in terms of the first part of their case, right, they tell you under our system, individual voters will have no accountability, right? So a few responses here. Firstly, we say that you have accountability at the point where you have to pay to get more votes, right? So at that point, you've invested a significant chunk of your income, you are likely to care about the outcome of that. Secondly, they just assert that for someone who buys 3 or 4 votes or whatever, and we think it's likely to be in that range, given that even 10% of your income, like having to pay that to get votes, significantly impacts your earning power. So we think it's max going to be about 10 votes, right? We think that for them to say that there are no repercussions for those people is simply an assertion. We think at the point where you have invested a large amount of money in the policies, in the candidates, in your ability to choose candidates and policies, you're more likely to want a good return on that investment, more likely to scrutinize your politicians more, so you're not going to get scammed. Then they tell you, but the specific reason it's bad is because people that do this have a specific agenda in mind, which might be a single issue. 2 responses to this. Firstly, we think that single issue voting is legitimate. It might not matter to me what the specific economic structure in a country is, but something like the issue of abortion rights or rights for immigrants or any one particular issue that affects my livelihood more strongly than anything else is something that matters. We think it's perfectly legitimate for people to vote on single issues. But secondly, we don't think it's always true that people only vote on single issues. They give you no reason to believe that they would be. We think at the point where you're electing members of parliament who vote on a large array of different issues, you are incentivized to want to pick people that more broadly align with your worldview in general. So it's absurd for them to suggest this would happen Holstege. So the second part of their case, no thank you, is this idea of corporate interest. So important to note, firstly, they minimize the impact of their own point when they say that the way that the system in the Netherlands is set up is that corporate capture is significantly less than in other countries, such as the United States, right? But then they say, it will change to be more like the United States because rich individuals, like CEOs of ExxonMobil, will be able to donate. So firstly, I think a lot of their analysis is predicated on an assumption of the kind of analysis that usually explains corporate capture by corporations. And distinct from popular opinion, corporations are not in fact people, which is why we didn't model it as corporations being able to buy votes. But even if we accept that some rich CEOs will be able to buy more votes, we say those people are firstly numerically few, right? There's probably max a few hundred people like that in the Netherlands, unlikely to significantly impact the voting in any particular district. But secondly, those are exactly the kind of people who already lobby the political system, already are in cahoots with elite politicians, already donate massively to political campaigns because they want the kind of favorable regulations for their companies, etc. The problem is that other people in that society cannot convert their income into votes in the way that these individuals already do. That is the problem that we are solving. I'll take back half.
Poor people in the Netherlands are much more likely to vote than in any other comparable country in the world, even before Geert Wilders. Why do you think that is true?
Well, you said it was true, so I'm just going to agree with you. But we also think if that is true, we still think the rich people have a disproportionate influence on the political system, which Chris has already proved. I'm going to back up when we think in the relative terms, poor people have it worse. Why is it legitimate to convert your income to votes? Some issues simply matter more to some individuals. I already alluded to this before. Not all policies affect everyone equally. So if I am a member of a white majority and the issue of the day is restricting immigration from countries outside the European Union, and that is the issue that most politicians and most votes are likely to be on in the foreseeable future. That doesn't matter to me that much, right? It doesn't affect my own personal well-being. If I am an immigrant or a child of an immigrant for whom that, the impact of that vote is an existential threat to my existence, then that is something that affects me more, right? So in that case, we think it is legitimate to want to prioritize your own self-interest in a way that, because they're affected to different degrees, they should be able to vote and to opt in to affect the system in different degrees. But we also think that it's fair if you don't care about the outcome of politics, or you feel like the system has irreparably failed you, it's fair for you to opt out, and then your income rises relative to the people who are using their income to influence politics. Note this already happens again for the richest. We're simply making an equal access problem. No, thank you. Third thing then, in terms of the imbalance between rich and poor. So the rich have an increased access to politics, even in countries like the Netherlands, right? Where and that access is based on an absolute bar, where you have to be part of the elite to be in it. This matters for 4 reasons. Firstly, because they physically have more money for lobbying for things like, things like the CEO of ExxonMobil that they talk about can directly lobby someone. Secondly, in many cases, they're like owners of companies and they're able to structure their time off in a way that allows them to pursue those political activities in which working class people, but also middle class people with regular jobs aren't able to do so. Thirdly, they have class connections. They tend to go to the most elite universities, hang out in the same places as these people, have direct access to them. Fourthly, the media weighs the opinions of those people significantly higher than working class or even middle class people, because the people that own the media are also part of that clique, right? We think that for them to assert that only middle class people would be empowered under this. 2 responses to this, right? Firstly, we say middle class people spend a larger proportion of their income on things like savings. They sometimes have the money invested in markets, etc. They're more likely to be spending and paying down their mortgage, whereas poorer people tend to rent. Secondly, if you are a member of a comfortable majority, then you're less likely to be strongly invested in politics, less likely to want to buy votes to increase this. We think that in a scenario where the elite already have this kind of access, we think it is principally legitimate that we allow this to even out. Finally, in terms of uninformed voting, which is ignored by opening opposition, we think at the point where, as an uninformed voter, your vote is relatively worth less than someone who has bought more votes, you're less likely to go and vote. But also, if you have bought more votes, you're more likely to vote in a more informed manner. For these reasons, we're practically opposed.
Panel, the Netherlands sees a very particular political problem that actually sits outside the recent shift in what some people refer to as global Trumpism, or the rise of very, very nationalist politics across Europe. Actually, Geert Wilders was a well-known name in the Netherlands and outside before, for instance, the migrant crisis that launched other similar figures to prominence. Notice what is needed in the Netherlands is a move to reset the political consensus, to reset the centre in Dutch politics. That is what we're hoping this mechanism can achieve. We have 2 points in extension. Firstly, in a detailed principled defence of why this is appropriate, talking about how this sort of, the ability to spend money to buy extra votes is comparable to other things we say you have the right to do. Secondly, more importantly, the mechanics by which this restores a consensus, restores a centre ground in politics, which is more liberal and more economically focused and does not speak to people's identities, does not threaten, for instance, the Muslim minority in the country. Before that, a couple of points of rebuttal. And there's one point of rebuttal. We've been told that there is a significant risk out of opening half here that someone will have enough money to buy a majority government. This is problematized in a POI. I'm going to go into more detail. Firstly, in the Netherlands, there's been such a long time where people have relied on coalition governments that there's simply not the trust in a simple majority government anywhere. This is not a country that is majoritarian in its political history, and so people are less likely to cooperate or less likely to be trusting of a government that has an outright majority and doesn't rule by consensus. Secondly, it is just implausible anyone spends enough money to get them radically a party from like 27% up to over 50%. Thirdly, the fact that there exists plenty of disagreement among the people who are most likely to be buying votes. I'll get into why it's going to be like doctors and teachers a little bit later, but we think this is probably the middle class who's more likely to spend this money, more likely to buy a few votes, and more likely to have an additional influence. Lastly, speaking to women and speaking to minorities in the community, we think with a focus on governance and focus on economic concerns that comprise the centrist policy, centrist sort of ideology we're hoping to go for, does give you an incentive to speak to the interests of women, because that's half the voter base and you want to try and get them involved. Most importantly, you're not dividing people along the lines of something like religion or something like national identity. Speaking to people's interests gets everyone involved and makes it much easier to try and negotiate with various groups in that way. Point 1, principle. We think all people have a right to spend the time they have at their disposal as they please to within reason, right? You can, if you choose, spend your time sitting at home watching Netflix, or you can go out and try and convince people to vote a certain way, or you can go out and try and lobby in a certain way to get government to change its policy. This is you deciding to spend your time in a way that changes government policy. It is not obvious why your time, something you own and have the right to dispose of, is radically dissimilar to money, something else you have the ownership of and the right to dispose of. We need principal distinction between the two, and we see it is reasonable that someone uses what they own, uses the property, this extension of themselves, in a way they please, so long as they're not actively harming others. We've heard no reason why this will actively harm another. We think it's simply reasonable that people use what is at their disposal in a way that they seem to think is reasonable. We've also been told that different people have a differential stake in what government does. Notice, certain people are more likely to be affected by radical shift in government policy, such as, for instance, a complete change in what they're concerned about. For instance, if you have several businesses, no thank you, if you have assets abroad, or you have large projects trying to run a family business, you're more likely to have your life projects changed changed effect to a large extent by changes in government policy. If suddenly the government is radically more socialist than it was, no thank you, then you're likely to see the business that you and your family have worked on for a long time change. We think it's reasonable to some extent people who have a larger stake in changes at government level have some ability to defend that in proportion to how they're affected. We think this is probably a broad principle defence. We think it's reasonable to say people can dispose of the property as they like, and we've heard no reason to say why it's different. But more importantly, how do we reset the centre in Dutch politics? Recognise, before we had sort of the rise of this movement across Europe, Geert Wilders was already creating problems for instance, and in particular, the Muslim population of the Netherlands. Firstly, he sends narratives that people are not welcome in the Netherlands. People who are of Muslim heritage or Muslim migrants in the Netherlands walking the streets sometimes feel unwelcome, feel intimidated. There have been instances of violence provoked and defended with his narrative. He presents the narrative that the establishment is somehow against you. This is a problem that we absolutely need to solve. The old centre is far more effective, it's more useful for this. Firstly, because it says the primary concern what government is focusing on is governing the economy well and making sure everyone has access to institutions and access to a good life. Recognise, this is well supported by the middle class voters we're talking about, who are more likely to have some disposable capital to buy this. They don't like racists, and insofar as they have more money, they have a larger stake in what government controls. Why are the middle class the most likely to start buying up these votes? It's not likely to be like the massive banker class. Well, first, it's because they have a bit of extra capital. Even within the scaling proportional to your pre-tax income, you still have more money to fall back on. You can still live comfortably even without this money. You're more likely to buy these votes, and it then becomes insurance against political degradation in a way that people have insurance against a house-going fire. I think it's probably quite reasonable, something we expect most middle-class voters in the Netherlands to go for. I think it's probably going to be useful. I'll move on to how this is particularly effective at resetting the consensus, but first I'll take back half.
So Geert Wilders and other parties on the far right have been explicitly running a platform that the government is anti-democratic. For example, saying that they need to have more referendum. What do you think their response will be to this particular policy?
Like, I don't think the supporters of Geert Wilders are particularly likely to be sensitive to changes in this regard, because most of what he relies on are identity claims and somewhat conspiratorial claims, which are quite useful at getting people's hackles up. They get people defensive or thinking emotionally. That's not effective, and that's largely the problem we're trying to solve. We don't think the sort of emotional responses that he relies on are going to be affected to a significant extent by changes in policy. We think probably that's disingenuous. Let's talk about, for instance, working class voters. Now, in the top half have discussed that people who are particularly very, very invested in politics are likely to buy some of these votes. Look, that's fine. These people are already members of political parties that already have some kind of stake in sort of the centrist project and more likely to vote along these economic lines and try and govern well. Crucially, the people who are like, hijacked by the Belgrade project, people who are, it's obviously not the case that Dutch people are now 14% more racist than they were 10 years ago. What's more likely to happen is people who've been left out of globalisation are now feeling they have someone who can try and help defend them, someone who's going to help them get some sort of benefit from being in society. These people, however, are not going to trade off some of their wealth to try and buy extra votes just so they can vote for Geert Wilders. We think they're probably more likely to not engage in the project. Crucially, what happens then? You see, you can build a coalition of voters among middle-class people who are more likely to try and defend an economic consensus. You have the people who are already invested in political parties who have this concern in favour of an economic consensus, a centrist consensus, are going to be buying more votes, and they have to create a buffer against this sort of extremist or against this sort of reactionary political agenda. We think that is probably very effective at trying to shift the centre ground back towards a situation where people are voting along economic lines, people are trying to govern effectively. I think this is probably better for the Netherlands because people are talking about how the country should be run, not talking about whether or not Muslim people are welcome in the country. That's crucially important. We say particularly you're more likely to protect this democratic consensus when you have, for instance, people who are left out of the system very often, people like Muslim migrants, are going to be then included much more effectively because we can talk about their interests, talk about how they get access to institutions, rather than talking about their identity or whether or not they're welcome. We say this community are probably the most important in this debate because insofar as the working class still have a lot of priority, they're provided for really, really well in the Netherlands. The Dutch welfare state is an example to us all, whereas this particular community have suffered consistent and continual abuse from Project Fear, like Geert Wilders provides. I think it's a problem, and if we can reset the political agenda in the Netherlands, we think we're much more likely to help them, much more likely to protect future generations. That happy to propose.
Imagine you are a poor voter in the Netherlands. Due to your disadvantages, you are less likely to be informed, less likely to be enfranchised. The past government, consisting of the Conservative and Labour coalition, has significantly cut your healthcare and have reduced it by a half the amount that you have access to government. Previously, you were voting for Labour Party or the Green Left, who were representing your interest in making sure you have access to basic services. Now what happens? The government introduces a policy, and those who are enfranchised, and those who are rich, and those most likely to be informed, are buying up more and more votes. You hear that someone who is in a higher income bracket from you has 10 votes. In order to exert any meaningful influence or exert as much influence as them, you need to buy 10 votes as well. We think that decrease of influence massively decreases the incentive of people to inform themselves, to campaign, or to vote in the first place. 2 points of extension. First, who exactly is going to buy up votes due to the structural disadvantages that exist for particular groups? Second of all, what are the impacts there for the most vulnerable? All rebuttal will be then after the extension, sort of responding given the extension of the vote. So, who's likely to vote? We think that whether you vote or not is dependent on the following. Are you willing to take the time to inform yourself, to go to the voting booth? And are you willing to invest a significant amount of time and effort in doing that? When are you most likely to take that time and effort? When you feel that you can reasonably influence the system and change the political system in a way which advantages you. What is the status quo? Currently, the poor, at least to a certain extent, or by not being completely equal, have the perception that they have influence as much as the rich, to a certain extent, because they have as much votes and they're willing to go to the voting booth to a large extent. Look, for example, that voter turnout among poor individuals in the Netherlands is the highest among any of the OECD countries. What do they change? We think it's very likely that the rich will be buying far more votes than the poor. Why? Because they are slightly more enfranchised. So even though the poor are less enfranchised, and still to a great extent under status quo, the rich are still more enfranchised. They have the feeling that the political system cares about them. Moreover, they are far more informed due to the reasons that they have had more education. The fact that for example, they are far more able to take up the cost of educating themselves. For example, they're far more able to buy newspapers, or the fact that they have far more time and far more leisure time, as opposed to the poor, who, for example, need to work 2 jobs a day and don't have the time to read The Economist at night. Therefore, they are far more likely to care about that political system and feel like that political system caters to them and cares about them. Therefore, the rich are far more likely to buy votes, even if the cost will be equal on either side of the house. So this is sort of an even if. Even if the cost for the rich and the poor would be the same, given that the rich feel that votes are far more influential for them and therefore are far more likely to do for them, they are far more likely to buy votes. Compare this to the poor, who are likely, due to the disadvantages and due to the disenfranchisement, have much less of a feeling that the system cares about them and feel like therefore that buying a vote will not matter as much. Especially when you hear this, that the rich now have bought 10 votes. That even further decreases your incentive to turn up and inform yourself to vote, because you hear that the well-off class, who is exerting influence over the political system, has bought up enormous amounts of votes, and therefore your influence even decreases. So when initially the rich are far more likely to buy votes, over time, the amounts of votes that the poor are going to buy is even further decreased, given that they feel they have less influence. So why is this all specifically problematic? The Netherlands is doing a reasonably good job of catering to the poor, and the reason is this. Due to the strong influence of labor unions, donations are restricted to a large extent to political parties, and the government gives equal amount of funding for campaigning to each political party. So therefore, the donation incentive isn't that significant as in other countries. What is your incentive is the amount of votes that you can capture and how much share of the majority you can get, given that increases your share within parliament. We think that at the point where you decrease the turnout and decrease the amount of votes that the poor are likely to buy, you give less of an incentive to the parties to cater to them. What is the impact of that? We will see significant cuts in public spending for the poor. So things like public education, public healthcare, things which they are completely dependent on are more likely to be taken away on that side of the house. So therefore, they specifically harm the poor. Why do they not get more informed voters? And here I want to deal with the opening government stuff. They say there is an incentive, for example, to inform other individuals. Here's the key thing. You have now the choice to either inform people and spend money on that, or spend more money on buying votes. We think for 3 reasons you're far more likely to simply buy more votes rather than spend more time informing other people. First of all, it takes far longer amount of time. You can directly buy a vote in the first election. It takes often years or multiple hours in order to inform certain people. Second, it's less certain. You can hand out random economists to individuals who you think are uninformed, but you do not know if they will take up that information, if they will read all of it. Third of all, it's more costly. You need to spend enormous amounts of funding into campaigning and spreading those campaigns to a wide extent. So we think that political parties, rather than informing others, they will encourage the existing voter base as much as possible, try to make them make sure that they represent as rich possible voting base, and encourage them to buy more votes as a consequence, or people are less likely to campaign and simply buy votes themselves. That is the OG material, therefore, out of the way. So we think therefore that's the impact of this debate is therefore that the poor are likely to get less access to fundamental rights. What then do we hear from CG? CG say 2 things. First of all, that the far right will be driven away from the center. I just want to point out this. The far right have been running on an extremely strong political platform of, current politics is not caring about you. Current politics is not working for you. And therefore, that is the reason that Geert Wilders and the Party for Freedom has been getting so much support. So we say one of 2 things. Either you really care about the center-left government coming into place, in which case that is less likely. Why? Because Geert Wilders is far likely to get more power at the point where people feel less enfranchised, and people are far more willing to vote for him at the point where they feel the government doesn't care. Or they feel that the current government is less democratic because it's giving more votes to the rich. Opening government.
For a per voter, the extra cost of a vote for 1 year would be €3 per week. From upper middle class tier voters, that could be as much as €80 a week. The effective reality is a cheaper access point for those voters who are already excluded from spending money.
Here's the thing, I've taken you at your best. That is at best a point of response to the opening opposition about opportunity cost. Here's what I'm saying. Even if both for a rich and a poor voter, the vote would cost €5. Let's say it's the exact same amount. One believes that spending that €5 gets them enormous amounts of influence back, given that the political system has historically enfranchised them, and given that they know lots of other individuals are also buying votes from their particular class. The other one believes that given that the system has historically disenfranchised them, they are less likely to be informed, less likely to care about politics, are less willing to spend that €5 in the first place. So therefore, even if the costs are saved, the fact that people care to a different extent about the political system that has disenfranchised them, make sure that that doesn't happen. They, at best, only skew it further to the right because they further disenfranchise voters. Why? Because that is contingent. The far right only gets far more power at the point where those people get less influence. That is what we prove on our side of the house.
Mark's from the government whip goes out to government funds
Panel, this debate has understandably come down to how the most vulnerable people in Dutch society are affected by such a policy. Note, however, that what me and Elliot do is identify the most vulnerable group in the current political climate and show how exploiting the short-term interests of the moneyed classes through positive externalities actually helps them and shifts the political climate away from a sort of cultural fight against what they see as increased immigration towards something that's more, once again, geared towards economics and re-empowers the centrist parties that firstly tend to gear themselves more towards economic policy and secondly aren't as culturally divisive as people like Geert-Wilders. So, basically, my speech will come down to two main points of clash. Firstly, just the principle discussing why we think it's principally okay and even accept the burden that we're disadvantaging the principled right for some people to have more of a democratic say in the short term, and then secondly the sort of vulnerable groups that we're talking about here and how we actually end up helping the most important group in this debate. I have one piece of rebuttal that I'll leave to the end. So, firstly, the principle. A lot of O's case is based on the immorality of waiting against people that may not be able to purchase these votes, saying that they're shut out the system a little bit. Yes, okay, we say it firstly to a certain extent that may be true, but note Elliot's response that we spend time, you're allowed to spend your time as you like within reason. Note as well that the money you earn is often a reflection of the amount of time that you've given up to someone else in order to garner this purchasing power. We say as an extension of the property you own, you should be able to garner more votes if you work for a certain amount of time, because we say that's completely within reason. But note as well that so we say as well that the way they frame this is about caring about the poor of the Netherlands, and they never sort of specified who they care about in this debate, okay, within that group. We say, however, caring about them is important, but caring about the refugees that are coming from the Middle East and Syria and the Muslims that already live within the Netherlands is more important. Why? Because not only do they suffer some of the same problems that they're talking about on OO and across the opposition bench, but note as well they also suffer the oppression of Geert-Wilders and the sort of structural racism that exists within the Netherlands. And secondly, if you're literally a refugee, it's unlikely that you have the access to the healthcare and all the benefits that you have as that Dutch citizens have throughout their time in living through the Netherlands, right? So we say that we help solve the coming problem of people like Geert-Wilders attacking these people by accepting to a certain extent that this will give the rich more influence. How does this work? Well, Elliot stood up and said, well, look, the rich vote for more centrist parties. Here are some reasons that he gave, and a couple more. Firstly, that the historic reasons that these centrist parties over the last 20, 10, 15, 30 years have been geared toward economic policy. So the party institutions like the PR, the policy think tanks, and the politicians themselves, and the mindset they're in, are still geared towards thinking in that way. And secondly, with regards to how they get votes, they think in a majoritarian way. They try not to divide society in a proportional representative system. What they're trying to do is take as many singular votes as they can, because they know that absolutely counts. So
that means that they're not trying to be divisive or targeting out single people. They're still, so their institution and the minds still work in this way. Reversely, parties like the Freedom Party, beginning to realise that the working class have been somewhat disadvantaged and left out by globalisation, have attached their own agenda to their disenfranchisement from the system that these centrist parties have been pushing for the last couple of decades, and saying that it's not, they're not critiquing specifically the economic system they're pushing, but some of the symptoms of it. For instance, globalisation, something that comes with it is a lot of immigration. This tends to be good for the economy, but what people like Geert Wilders have done is painted that as a negative harm against the working class votes that he's beginning to take up. Okay. We say that by giving more votes to the wealthy, they're more likely to vote for these centrist parties. Why? Because as we said, these centrist parties are geared towards economic thinking. Because middle class and rich people have more of a stake in the economy, that's more what they care about, they're likely to vote for them. Note for them as well that they tend to be quite to a certain degree fond of immigrants, because they might very well be the labour that helps come in and prop up their business and give them help them produce more. So they're actually quite what's the word I'm thinking of, in favour of it. So, what we're saying is, yes, we're happy for them to buy more votes and push these centrist parties back and push out the far-right parties. How do we think that this works then to our benefits, okay? Well, the fact of the matter is that when these parties now are fully redominating or have more power back in the political system, it literally means that the Freedom Party can't take up the space that they want to take up. It means they're not able to stand in the Dutch Parliament and give derogatory speeches about the Muslims of the Netherlands, and then they're not able to, set about policy and create policies that actually end up harming them that in a less abstract way. In the long run, this means less antagonism against refugees and Muslims, that we think are very important in this debate. Note as well, I'll take opening in a couple of seconds, note as well that we think in the long run, what's more likely to happen is that as the rich become more and more comfortable with seeing that these centrist parties that focus on these things are back into power, they're less likely to buy these votes in the future because their safety is assured. Yes.
Chemical power plants pump waste into rivers that eventually make the soil infertile for migrant farmers. What incentive does the Center Dutch have to reshape itself and cater to the farmers when the chemical power plant owners are much more likely to have more political sway?
So that's an interesting question about environmentalism and politics. No, it doesn't necessarily engage with what me and Elliot have been saying specifically. As I've said, they still have an incentive to gear themselves towards each individual voter because each individual voter counts. I'm going to quickly just discuss how we clashed with closing in the last couple of seconds of the speech. So firstly, they say, well, when the poor has less votes, this equals cuts to public services. This simply isn't true, because rich, yes, they'll still have more votes, care about these public services. Firstly, because they still want to use them, they'll still want to use the health services, and they'll still want to use the roads. But no, they also have the vested interest in ensuring that they work, because the people that go in there to use the health services and the infrastructure contribute to their business and their overall capital. So they have a double sort of interest in ensuring they work. They also say that what's going to happen here is Geert Wilders will get more power because all the people we're talking about will get really angry. We say this simply doesn't make sense at the point when the centrist parties are blocking Geert Wilders out of parliament. Happy to accept in the short term there'll be a certain degree of outrage if that's what they're going to try and go for, but they can't translate this into actual policy and political power. We say in the long run, to try and get their voice back, the poor voters will go back to more social democratic or even maybe socialist parties that don't focus on this cultural divide. We've identified the group that is the most important in this debate in terms of vulnerability. We found a pretty interesting way of securing NHS vote.
That's nice. So welcome the opposition rep to close out the opposition case.
The most important impact that I want you as a panel to take into account when deciding which team wins is the impact of special needs children who are unable to go to regular education, because there are cuts made by the previous coalition who was at stake, where the largest party was the Liberal Party in the Netherlands. The cuts that were made for healthcare, the cuts that were made for health insurance, which meant that poorer people had to spend hundreds of euros more every month to be able to actually go to the doctor, and who are now currently scared to go to the doctor because they have their own risk that they still have to pay. These are real impacts that make sure that people get ill, that people might die, and at least that people have so much more care for their livelihood and are very worried. We think that these are the people that in the status quo are not going to buy more votes. I think that Floris explained that to you, but I'm going to lighten it up again. But this is the impact that ultimately ties down to that. When they are disenfranchised, unable to vote to that extent, these are the costs that you as a panel have to be willing to make. We don't think that that is fair. I'm going to talk about that furtherly in my speech. So I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, about the power disbalance in favor of the rich. Secondly, about disenfranchisement. And thirdly, about the middle class. So firstly, power disbalance in favor of the poor. Let's look at the problem definition that we get from OG. Because they say that currently in the Netherlands there's an elite and that they donate to campaigns and they donate to parties and there's a lot of lobbying. So they have more power, which means that therefore we have to kind of like give more power also to poorer people. Floris gives you the context that disproves that. Namely, in the Netherlands, lobbying is not a thing because labor unions are part of conversations with parliamentarians and with policymakers. This is one of the reasons that lobbying is just simply does not exist in the Netherlands because they already have power in that way. That is not something that rich corporations have. That is something that happens with labor unions who care also for poorer people. But also the fact that Floris explains to you that campaign budget are capped, right? So you're not allowed to spend a lot of money on campaigning and you're not allowed to donate a lot to parties. So the power that rich people have is very different from any other country in the world, which is one of the reasons that the system works better than other ones, like in this case. That does not mean that poor people are very enfranchised and just as enfranchised as the rich. There are still issues with that, but mind you that the urgency that they talk about of having that power balance fixed is not an urgency that exists. So having that fall out of the way, the problem that they want to solve is not that big that they want to talk about. Let's look at why the situation actually gets worse. Floris explains to you what the status quo is. We have the Labour Party, but also Socialist Party and the Green Party, who are relatively big in parliament. These are parties that have very big incentives to cater to poorer people. So one of the reasons that one of the biggest cuts on health insurance were actually able to be blocked was because the Labour Union did that, because a lot of the Labour Party did that, because a lot of their people who vote for them are poorer people. We think that that is an incentive that exists in the status quo. What happens on the proposition side of the house? Floris explains to you why people are going to be poorer people are going to be less likely to vote. And he does it in a more detailed way than what the first half does. What does first half do? They say your money is worth more to you if you're poor, so that is money that you're not going to spend. But Floris actually adds a lot to that. He also says, even if it's true what what proposition says, taking them at their best, if it's just €3 a week, which we still think is kind of a big amount, then still the opportunity costs of informing yourself is also something that poor people are going to be less likely to do. And this is something that adds to that, which means that the burden to vote is even bigger. But mind you also that the threshold to engage in the first place in politics is going to be much higher under their side of the house, which means that, for example, a lot of 18-year-olds who are going to be allowed to vote, which happens every day, are going to be less likely to do that when they're poor under their side of the house. I'm going to talk more about that further. But the point is this: comparatively, less poor people are going to be voting. That means that these parties are going to have less incentive to care for these people. That means that these cuts are going to happen, which is horrible. So let's look at those disenfranchised voters and explain what happens to them. So first, government says we have to get more informed voters. The problem with this is that caring about politics is not the same thing as being informed, right? Political socialization happens. A lot of people identify with a party, but are not necessarily very critical towards that party or necessarily very informed about that. They've given us no mechanism to understand at all why people would inform themselves better. That would have maybe been an argument in a debate about having a current affairs test before you're allowed to vote. We just don't think that people who necessarily care about politics also are going to be the ones that inform themselves. So we don't think that is something that they're going to solve. But furthermore, we were really shocked when the Prime Minister said, if you don't care about politics, fine, then you're not going to vote. The thing is this: in the Netherlands, the turnout rate of people has been rising over the past years. A lot of people are tuning into politics. A lot of people are engaging in politics much more every year. That is for a few reasons, because there are more parties. That means that people feel more represented, and maybe also because of Geert Wilders. But at least we think that is something that we appreciate, that people are going into politics and explaining their concerns there. Mind you, that starting politics, and this is something that Floris explains, being the one that engages in the first place is really difficult, because now you don't just have to inform yourself and don't just have to go out to the voting booth, you also have to make sure that you pay that money. And this is not €3 a week for a vote. This means, because you know that the middle class has 10 votes, that means €30 a week for a vote. So that means that your one vote just doesn't matter as much. Under our side of the house, the moment you get interested, the moment you have this idea of I want to do something, you can go out and vote. We make the threshold extremely low. Under their side, the threshold is much higher, which means that a lot of less people are going to vote, specifically people who don't have that time and don't have all of those things. We think that is extremely problematic. So then let's look at the middle class. Second half says it's an extension of the money you earn. If you have more money, we think you have more right to, you deserve like more power. We think that is problematic because poor people depend much more on the state than richer people do, right? Poor people depend on welfare, they depend on public services, they depend on healthcare much more than rich people do because they can just buy it for themselves, right? So if you believe that claim, then that is actually something that doesn't help them, but helps our side. Because that means that we should like cater much more to poor people and not making sure that the richer people can buy that. But also we think that ultimately when they talk about you're going to be able to be against extremists and filter them out, we don't think that that is a benefit. We think that it's unfair to shut out democratic decisions the moment that us elitists don't agree with that decision. This is the statement that we're willing to take. We're saying if these people vote, if they engage in politics, and they decide that their concerns are too big, and therefore they want to electrocute builders, that is not something that we think is a bad thing, and we think it's extremely wrong to filter out that decision by making sure that richer people get more votes and therefore being able to push through their own decision. If you don't like democratic processes, just stop democracy at all, but you should not like pretend that you are living in a democratic situation while at the moment that other people want to engage, you don't want to listen to their concerns. We think for all of those reasons, the most democratic option is to make the threshold as low as possible, making it easier for people to engage, and that means direct money, direct livelihoods made for these people. For those reasons, we ask you to oppose.
Let's thank the speakers for those rounds. Could I check with any speakers who would like this video to not be put on the internet? Looks like that. If you'd like to